Welcome to Prose from the Underground, coming to you from my basement in northern Michigan, where I read, write, think, and say things, and quite often I get to talk to someone. For instance, today I talked to Kelli Fitzpatrick, a mighty writer, researcher, reader, and teacher, whom I met years ago when she was writing what I would call magical realism and doing it very well. Since then, she's written flash fiction, conventional literary fiction. She's written essays of various sort, won awards, had publications. And then she went on to do some compelling things for those of us interested in craft. For instance, she wrote Tabletop Role-Playing Game Narrative. In other words, the guide that gamers use as they put together their own stories. She also threw both feet, all tentacles and antennae, into science fiction. Became so interested in the science part of science fiction that she recently took an internship with NASA. Yes, the space people. She's going to talk a bit about that today. Also, she'll tell us something about her studies at Iowa State University's MFA program. And I think she will offer some advice that transcends subgenre. But if you're especially interested in speculative genres, tune your antennae in, put your sonic devices on high. I hope you enjoy. Here we are with Kelli Fitzpatrick. Please read for us a bit if you would.
Sure. So this excerpt is from a short story called Breaking Up Light that was published in an online journal called KYSO Flash. And the context here is that the main character has shown up to pick up someone named Josie to go on a date, except her chicken has escaped. And so she asks him to help her find it before they go on the date. Beside the shed, there's a huge tree stump with wicked burn marks down the side. I climb on, hook my fingers around the eave, and pull myself up. Settling on the edge, feet dangling, I see rows of crops angling to the east like a bundle of twine gathered at the horizon. I train my eyes on the near ground and watch for signs of chicken. They're stirring all over. Slight breeze in the weeds, cat flicking its tail on a fence. With the sun gone, bats swoop and snap up the skeeters swarming the yard lamp, jagged little shadows breaking up light. Josie's rattle call cuts across the property and blends with cricket song, a wild thing in its own right.
Awesome, thank you. There are many layers here. Could you tell us how long that piece is in total? It's a flash piece.
Oh, yes, it's a flash fiction piece.
Okay.
So like 1,000 words, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Super brief, very compact, lots going on there. Anybody who gets a whiff of that knows that this writer has a sense of craft. There's thick tension, great description. So you studied literary fiction, you're studying literary fiction, and yet very recently, you decided to throw yourself into science fiction. So you've entered speculative genre. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship when you moved into science fiction and just embraced that genre? What changed for you? What elements maybe are more in your face, or what issues are you considering now that maybe you wouldn't have in, say, a traditional literary fiction?
Sure. So I would say that science fiction sort of grabbed me. I won a Star Trek writing contest in 2016. And I picked up writing Star Trek just because I am a Star Trek fan and thought, this is a fairly easy thing that I think I can step into. I can recreate these characters in these settings in this utopian, world. And it worked. And so then I sort of got pulled into the larger world of sci-fi fantasy writing, and so now I'm getting to explore that more. Although I would say I don't see them as completely separate worlds. I feel like all of the things that are relevant to good storytelling in literary fiction are just as relevant in science fiction. In sci-fi, it is speculative, so it's a genre of what if, what could be, what might have been, and it deals very heavily with ideas and often has some sort it's rule bound. So whether that's just the laws of physics or the laws of a potential physics that you're working with, it's very sort of ideas focused, and I really enjoy that. It's a playground for philosophical exploration.
Mm.
And some people would classify sci-fi as having tropes, and there are recognizable tropes within the genre. You're going to see aliens, you're going to see time travel, you're going to see spaceships, etc. But at its core, it's still story. And I have read some sci-fi that does really amazing things with craft and language, and that's sort of what I aspire to, is to sort of like blend these two things together.
Any for instances that you'd like to heave out to us?
Oh, like examples.
Yeah.
This Is How You Lose the Time War, by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone, is a gorgeous piece of literary fiction that is all about time travel.
All right. Great. Great.
Yeah.
Great. So we will throw that up and make sure people go check that out. Really savvy. What strikes me, and we could have probably a long, interesting conversation about the rule boundedness. It seems to me that the rules that you establish within that world, in some ways, might be really helpful in sort of compressing your narration. There's so many writers tell me that the big challenge, especially early in a project, is the multitudes, all the variability, the things that can happen here. And if you have some imposed rules, they might provide some kind of funnel for your brain to go to and help you to keep chugging along.
I would agree with that. And, if you are developing a sci-fi setting, you might have new societies, you might have technology, you might have new transportation, you might have literally new ways that physics or metaphysics works. And so I feel like you have to make choices so as not to overwhelm the reader. And anything that you bring in, this is one of the things that I've learned from one of my philosophy advisors here in my program, is that if you're going to bring a thing into your story, it needs to be intentional,
Mhm.
and you need to sort of commit to then doing that thing justice within your story. So you don't want to just grab anything and everything and sort of dump it, unless you're going for chaos. but you want to choose carefully and then sort of proceed with integrity in handling those ideas.
Could you talk briefly too about your tabletop game narrative writing? So you're inside of this world. It's a genre. It's also probably a culture. What is that briefly for those folks who may not know? And how has your study in literary fiction or science fiction, how has that translated to that?
Sure. So this is tabletop role playing. If you are familiar with Dungeons and Dragons or have heard of it, it's that style of gameplay where players get together, usually around a table. They each embody a character. You roll dice to determine the outcomes of certain places, and you're essentially telling a collaborative story together. There's a game master who sort of guides the story along, and it's meant to be, a form of entertainment. I ended up in the writing of this through Star Trek. So there's a game called Star Trek Adventures that's from Modiphius Entertainment, and they write amazing, beautiful books of Star Trek stories and settings for people to use who play these games. And so it was an easy transition for me from writing Star Trek fiction to writing Star Trek game writing. And it was just a blast. And so now I've done quite a bit of that for that line. I also write for Archvillain Games for some unannounced projects. They haven't announced them yet, but so that's in the fantasy genre, but a lot of overlap. And it's when you're writing for games, there's no central character because the player is the character. They bring their own character to the table. And so you have to set up the bones of a story that can work with any protagonist. And that was the major difference for me in switching from fiction writing over, but there's a lot of, I guess, overlaps because in my studies, I've been working a lot with like, well, what makes a character arc satisfying, even in just like a short story? What are the different things that you have to, the necessary and sufficient conditions you have to meet to have that? And so that's helpful for me in both genres. So sort of thinking about uh, boil the thing down to like what moving parts do you really need to make a story? Decision points, setting, conflict. And then also in my script writing class that I'm in right now, we're reading this book called Playwriting Brief and Brilliant by Julie Jensen. And she talks about characters needing to be off balance to be interesting. And so that somehow their world has been like shifted or has wrong-footed them in a way. And that's like perfect for both, fiction, for playwriting, and for game writing, I think.
Beautiful, beautiful. That's super helpful. I can imagine what you said. We're so, those of us in fiction are so used to fixating on the protagonists, singular or plural, usually singular. And what a really good intellectual activity to void the protagonist and just go after the qualities, the elements that would make protagonism.
Right. Like what's the thing surrounding it? What goes into making a decision point for a character that could work for any character?
Yeah, really nice. I also like your phrase. What is it? Wrong-footed. When the character has been wrong-footed, somehow the world has pivoted, heaved, thrown, bucked someone, and bingo! Now you've got something to do, something to work with. You've already given us lots to think about. And by the way, briefly, you also, it's worth noting that you're so interested in the speculative and the science to science fiction that you spent a summer interning for NASA.
I did, believe it or not. It's one of the coolest things I've ever done. So my MFA program requires us to do a field experience in something environmental because the degree is in creative writing and environment. And so we get to set that up. And so since I am writing primarily science fiction, it made sense for me to learn about space environments. So the folks at Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland kindly arranged an internship where I got to learn from this team of amazing astrophysicists and exoplanet scientists about space environments and how they work and how they operate. And I got to spend 2 days on site with the Hubble Space Telescope, and it was amazing.
Holy cow, that's great. How many of us can say that, especially we writers? You got to hang out with Hubble. Good
Mhm.
Lord. And I suspect, I don't want to, set you up necessarily, but I can smell coming in the future how all of this may coagulate into a very cool project. Is that fair to say?
Yes, so I'm working on a couple of larger projects right now, a novel that sort of pulls all of this together, that I would say hopefully will be considered both very much science fiction, playing with some really cool rules, but also will satisfy folks who enjoy a good literary book.
I will be first in line, and if I'm not, I will move someone aside. That's how I feel right now about it. One last question for us today. You're now going into your second year of formal study at Iowa State, and I know that you studied rigorously before going to Iowa. But could you share with us this first? Now you've done one full year. You're going into your second. Is there any specific or singular? I know there are many, but give us a singular insight or approach or understanding that you have now that has really bonked you on the head about craft that maybe you didn't have a year ago.
So I'm going to give you two, but I'll make them brief.
Two.
So one of them is from my script writing professor, Dr. Carissa Menifee, and she requires us to do something called daily pages when we are in her script writing workshop. And that literally just means when we're in the process of writing a play or a screenplay, we have to turn in 2 pages of freshly written script every single day for several weeks until we hit the page count. And at first I was like, this is not my process. I usually like dive in in and like do the whole thing in one go. And it actually turned out to be brilliant because by forcing there to be some breathing room between the drafting process, I ended up with much more natural sounding dialogue, and I had time to sort of think through the things, and I think the story ended up sounding much more natural and believable than if I had just sort of carved the whole thing out of a block in one setting. And so that's mapping onto that practice of sort of whittling away at it when doing a rough draft has proven useful in all different types of writing.
Great.
And then the other one is learning how to do a book proposal in my fiction workshop with Kenny Cook. And this is exactly what it sounds. It's a document that where you map out, here's the place, the time, the tone, the point of view, the themes that I'm planning for this book. Here are the major characters and what they want. Here's my approach to narrative design. Here's, story synopses or chapter synopses, depending on what kind of book it is. And I was like, okay, so it's like an outline, but it's more than that. It's like this working document that you can update as you work on the book to keep track of the decisions that you've made. And it's been transformative, especially for someone like me who's a planner and I like to have everything organized. And so
Great. Wow, thanks so much.
For sure. Thank you so much for having me, John.